What's going on, everyone? So the new Relic system released just a little bit ago, and well, we've done a couple of videos on it. We've talked about the new Holy Grail War, what to spend our resources on, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to hear about that anymore today. Instead, I wanted to focus on the new stats, because a lot of people have been asking me about these new stats in our stat screen, the new Tenacity, Armor Break stats of that note. And how much do they matter? Should I be going for them when I'm looking at relics or whatever it is I'm looking at? What do these stats actually do? And how do they affect me? And if you guys want to just stay for a minute here, the TLDR is they basically do not matter at all, like zero, unless you are someone that is going to be a competitor in PvP. If you are going to be a PvP enjoyer, you're going to want to pay attention to these stats. If you are not someone who wants to compete in PvP or really kind of boost up their rank, then you can completely ignore these stats and just continue to progress in your normal PvE progression. Now, fortunately for me and for all of you, everyone has already done the resourcing and math behind the scenes. So instead, I'm going to pull up that Capybara Discord, and I'll leave a link to it down below, as I tried to do for you all to check out. Let's hop over there. Alrighty, so we're over at the Tenacity / Penetration and Armor Break frequently asked questions, which, well, we had a lot of them when the game first released these stats. And you can see they put a little summary here, which is basically what I mentioned earlier. They only work in PvP. Tenacity, this one, as they say, lowers your opponent's damage, and Penetration lowers your opponent's damage reduction. Now, this is kind of, I want to say self-explanatory, but reasonably explanatory inside of the game already. But basically, you're going to be reducing your opponent's bonus damage with additional tenacity, and you're going to be reducing your opponent's bonus damage reduction with penetration. Okay? Now, these, as they say, are not like, I have tenacity, you have penetration. Therefore, if I have 100 tenacity and you have 100 penetration, it just washes each other out. It's not at all how this works. Instead, you can look here, which was, well, basically the delta or the difference of the effect. Depending on their tenacity versus your ignore tenacity and their penetration versus your ignore penetration, you're essentially going to see that at around 7,000 difference or delta, you're going to have a big noticeable effect on the effectiveness of your tenacity and penetration. The idea here is that if your opponent has a ton, okay, of tenacity, you're going to do less damage. So you need to have a lot of ignore tenacity. As they say, you could go around 3,000 difference between their tenacity and your ignore tenacity. So if you have, let's say, 6,000 ignore tenacity and your opponent has 3,000 ignore just regular tenacity, well, you're going to find itself that it's going to have a reasonable effect. And as they say here, the math is around 30% of that, well, layer is actually removed, but around 70 or 7,000 is where you're really going to see a big effect. And you can see here, as you get more and more, there's going to be pretty diminishing returns. Now, they say the sweet spot is around 3,000 to 7,000, which makes a lot of sense that there's a little diminishing returns as you get more and more difference between their tenacity and your ignore tenacity. But really, how much does this matter? Well, it really depends on how much your opponent cares about it. Because if you're the only one building a bunch of ignore tenacity, well, you don't actually get any benefit from it unless your opponent actually has tenacity, okay, and you're actually building a big difference on it. If your opponent just has minor amounts, well, you can easily acquire a big difference, and not to mention them having not that much tenacity is really easy to acquire that big difference. Instead, it's only a stat that you should be focusing on if your opponents are focusing on it, which means you can actually get a big bang for your buck if you're someone who's a little bit lower in PvP, but might want to break in a little bit higher in terms of qualifying rounds, whether it's for Holy Grail or for the martial arts tournament, by just building a little bit of ignore tenacity and ignore penetration. And the same thing applies for your own tenacity and your own penetration, right? If you are building a lot of tenacity, you're going to be lowering your opponent's damage. If you're building a lot of penetration, you're going to be able to ignore a lot of damage reduction. As a reminder, this formula is, well, your tenacity minus their ignore tenacity, or their tenacity minus your ignore tenacity equals the tenacity difference. So we're talking about, okay, well, if around 3,000 to 7,000 difference is what I want to shoot for, and this is how it works, and this is what PvP is for, but what does it actually mean? Like, what does it actually mean? Well, let's say, for example, we had around 3,000 difference. It says that roughly 30% of that layer is removed. Well, what does that mean? Okay, so if your opponent has, let's say, 100% bonus damage, and you have 3,000 difference for, well, as you can see, it reduces your opponent's damage. So let's say you have a 3,000 difference in terms of tenacity versus ignore tenacity. Your tenacity or ignore tenacity is going to remove 30% of that bonus damage. So instead of having 100%, they're going to have 70% bonus damage. And that's how this functions. That's how you're getting the value out of it. So now typically we see Frankenstein being very, very powerful and you know, brands and kind of builds like that where your opponent has a lot of damage reduction. So now they also are building a lot of damage because it's really good in PvE, but damage reduction is really when you start getting to the top echelons, you start to really try to get a lot of all the different stats, since there isn't really a whole lot of cap to it when you're considering PvP mechanics. And so when you're looking at, well, damage reduction, penetration seems to be a little bit more valuable in most cases. Obviously, tenacity is still also really good because you're going to be able to reduce your opponent's damage, but having a lot of penetration, more so than your opponent's ignore penetration, could potentially remove, if you're around 7,000, 50% of their damage reduction, which is disgusting. We already know how much one single percentage point can matter in PvE, and now PvP isn't as harsh because there's not as crazy scaling elements going on with the attack power and the overall damage output of characters versus AI, but it's still something they should really be potentially looking into if you are wanting to min-max your PvP output. And they also put together a little bit of a chart to find out where all these stats are coming from. These are all the stats you could potentially acquire if you have every relic at 0 stars. There's a lot of really good ones in here. And of course, my focus is going to be on the final skill damage, you know, the damage based ones like, you know, basic attack crit rate's actually pretty good. Attack percentage, global attack percentage, that type of stuff, right? The tenacity and armor break or penetration is really what we're talking about here. And you can see it's actually reasonably difficult to have the, well, instead of just tenacity, but the ignore tenacity or tenacity resistance or penetration resistance / armor break resistance. That is going to be harder to acquire. And so if, let's say you have 7,000 tenacity and your opponent has 7,000 tenacity and you both can't really cut through, right? Well, great. Okay, your tenacity is going to, well, reduce your opponent's damage. Your armor break or penetration is going to lower your opponent's damage reduction. And so in the end, if you're all focusing on this, it's going to kind of break even. But these are kind of some things that you want to, break points, I should say, that you're going to want to look for. And as per usual, the more things that Capybara Go adds, the more complicated the game gets. But as I mentioned earlier, if you are a PvE enjoyer, or maybe you are someone that enjoys PvP, but you're maybe a free-to-play player or a low spender, you can basically just ignore this entire thing. And it really only comes from the Relic system. And so, to be honest, most of the people are going to be going for whatever they possibly can. They're not even going to be trying to look for specific ones that give you tenacity or penetration and things like that. Really, you're going to find that from a lot of these mythic relics. For example, the one I'm getting is going to give me a lot of tenacity, which will go ahead and, well, reduce my opponent's damage, but I'm not really worried about that. I'm more considered with the final skill damage rather than all the other stats. So hopefully this was helpful for those of you that enjoy PvP. Again, I will leave a link to this down below so you guys can check out and, well, do all the math calculations if you'd like, as there's a full formula for you to do if you're interested in it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.